that's the youth as well, and the rest of you would take a peek at the overheads, please.
We are looking for musicians to serve on our worship teams. Our current needs are lead guitar, keyboards, drums, and bass. For more information, call 986-3396.
The guest services team needs your help being the hands and feet of Jesus. We need volunteers to be greeters, ushers, and at the information desk. You serve once a month for just a few hours. Help us create a welcoming environment for all who walk through our doors. Contact Tin Mayer, 986-3389.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you all. About 30 years ago, I read a book. And in the book, the first line, it said, "Life is difficult." This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths. It is a great truth because once we truly see this, we transcend it. That's from a book called The Road Less Traveled. It was a New York Times bestseller back in the early 80s, written by Dr. M. Scott Peck. And back in those days, I was pretty whacked out. So I started going to therapy. I was going to a Christian counselor, and as I was going to counseling, he told me to read this book. And from the first line of that book, all of a sudden, I realized one of the things that I was dealing with in my life was I was running away from difficulty. I was looking for the easy life. You ever been there? I was looking for everything to kind of fall in place where there would be no challenges, that wouldn't be too hard, that it would be easy to just kind of step aside of it and keep going in life, because I bought into this kind of system of beliefs that if you believe in God and you trust Him and you pray, then He'll answer all your prayers and everything will be hunky-dory. And it wasn't long till I began to find out that this wasn't exactly true. That all of a sudden I was dealing with incredible difficulties and disappointments and relationships with women. Now that was another story. It was like I was running from every relationship that was seeming to form, and I couldn't just engage, and I couldn't risk myself. And I go, what's wrong with me? And so as I started going through therapy, I began to realize that I was running away from this truth. That I just didn't grasp the reality that life really is difficult. But once we accept that, we can face it. And I don't know what's going on in all of your lives, but it's not too far to surmise that there is something going on in different people's lives at different times that it's incredibly difficult what you're facing. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, was one of these guys that as I look at how he was so missional in his life that there are those moments that he came across barriers and God seemingly stepped in and brought some revelation in his life that helped him to keep going. And I just pray that as we face the things in life that we're facing, that as we are standing right here, it's kind of that feeling like, I'm just going to throw in the towel. It's just too hard. I just can't keep doing this thing called life. I wish it was easier. We have to understand that it's just not going to get easier. In fact, with what I see happening in the world today, it's very possible that we may see things get way harder before they get better. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's the reality, that we are living in a very uncertain world economically, politically, socially, that we have to, in a sense, be geared up and be ready to face what is coming. And I think there's only a couple ways that we can face that. It's in knowing that we're not alone. If you're a parent, maybe you feel like you're a failure at being a parent. You actually feel sorry for your kids because they have to put up with you. And you feel like throwing in the towel. I've talked to many parents that you just feel like getting in the car and driving away, and you wish you could. Ever been there? Maybe you feel like a failure in your career, in your job, that it just hasn't gone the way that you envisioned and you dreamed, and you feel like throwing in the towel, that you're done. You're tired of making money for other people. You ever feel that way? You're tired of busting your buns 40, 50, 60 hours a week and seemingly have nothing to show for it. It seems like the more you make, the more things cost, and you have nothing to show for it. And you feel like throwing in the towel. Maybe in relationships, you're like I was, that it seems like you just can't make relationships work, that you get close to a person and it seems like things are going somewhere and you do something extremely stupid and it just all of a sudden crumbles in your hands and you go, will I ever have a significant relationship? Am I going to face life alone? And this feeling and this fear that you have of facing life alone makes you want to throw in the towel. But I want you to know that you're not alone in having those thoughts of facing those difficulties. If we were really transparent and candid with each other, all of us would say that we either have been there or we're there now in so many different ways. No matter how old we are facing things in our life that we wish just weren't there. So as we look at the scriptures and we continue in our series in the book of Acts, I see some incredible insights of the Apostle Paul as he has continued to move forward in being a missional person of following Jesus and following the things that God was leading him to do. That it wasn't all peachy hunky-dory for the dude. That he faced incredible discouragement. And that's what I see in this section of Acts 18. And I want you to turn with me to Acts 18. Now it says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And Corinth is a very interesting town. That Corinth is a major port city. And Corinth was really known for kind of being like the Vegas of Greece. That it was like the seed of paganism and pagan worship that was extremely, extremely sinful and vile. And this is the environment that Paul was going into. And there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. It's interesting, Seleucus was a historian that said that in 49 AD, Claudius, who was the Caesar of Rome at the time, he made an actual edict like this to kick the Jews out of Rome because Rome was beginning to have problems and they were blaming the Jews for all of their problems. Okay? And just be aware that whenever a country starts having problems, they all usually look for a scapegoat. Did you ever hear of the Jews in Germany in the 1930s and 40s? There's a great statement right there. Now, so Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. And every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Now, it's interesting that as you see a tent maker, from a Western point of view, we think of tents as being a big structure that you would go into Cabela's and buy a big tent that maybe the Apostle Paul made, right? But I had a Messianic Jew, he was a rabbi. He actually told me and gave me some insights into this a few years ago. And this really was one of those things that, wow, that's pretty cool. What these tents are is basically a prayer shawl. And Jewish men would put these prayer shawls, and they would kind of come down the front, and they would, when they went to pray, they would put it over their heads, and it would cover their heads. And these were actually called prayer tents. This is what Jewish scholars really believe. This is what Paul was making here, was these prayer shawls, not a big tent to live in, okay? And so when Jesus said in Matthew 6, 5 and 6, he says, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." And so what Jesus is talking about here is take your prayer shawl and go into your room. You put it over your head, and you close yourself into your prayer room, and that is where you pray. You're not doing it out in public where people see you so that you appear more spiritual. If you go to Israel, and by the way, we are planning another tour of Israel in May of 2011, and if you would like to come with us to go see, like the Western Wall, where you will see the Jews go to the Western Wall, and they'll put their prayer shawls over their head, and they'll close themselves into their prayer room. This is exactly what Jesus is talking about here. And so Paul made these prayer shawls for people to go into their room. Point I want to make in that is Paul was very serious about his devotion to God. That I believe that Paul regularly went into his prayer room, put his prayer tent over his head, and would go into his prayer room, and he would seek the Father, and he would pray. And I believe that it was during a moment like this that we will see that God visits Paul and speaks to him. So what is your prayer room? You may have a prayer shawl, but most of us probably don't. But there is some place that you typically go to that you seek the Father. Maybe you don't have a place like that. And I think the message for us today is find a place like that. Find your own prayer room. That is a place that you can go to regularly to seek the Father, where He can speak to you. When we feel like giving up, when we feel like throwing in the towel, it's at that moment more than any other we should be going to our prayer room and seeking the Lord, seeking a word from Him, seeking His presence in our life. And I think that's what Paul did. Now, as he did this, it says, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia. So Paul went first, Silas and Timothy followed. Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. As we always see, Paul always goes to the Jews first, and he preaches to them about Jesus Christ, the risen Lord, the Messiah, the Savior of the world. Paul always went to the Jews first. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, and here we see in Paul, a situation in Paul as he's preaching to Jews. We've seen this in the previous chapters. Whenever he would go into the synagogues and talk about Jesus the Messiah, the Jews always opposed him. And one thing you guys need to know is that if you choose to follow Christ and you choose to be a witness for him, who you may face the most opposition from is not people in the world. It may be people in the church. Because people that deal with religious spirits become very critical. And so just know, as pastors affectionately say, sheep have sharp teeth. This is what Paul is experiencing here. And he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am clear of my responsibility. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Now we think, well, Paul is just being strong and he's just speaking out. You know what I think? I think he was frustrated. I think he was the end of his rope and he said, forget you guys, I'm out of here. How many times do we feel like the same thing? For those of you that have been in any kind of ministry, if you truly engage in following Christ and being involved in going out to encounter the world, you know what it's like. You know what it's like to face incredible frustration and difficulty with the very people that you're ministering to as they turn back on you. This is what Paul is experiencing. And so in his frustration, I can see how Paul would feel alone. I could see how Paul would say, you know, Lord, I don't know if this is worth it. Your people aren't listening to me. And so what does he do? He goes right next door. He leaves the synagogue, goes next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. And in his house is this dude named Crispus. Crispus is the synagogue ruler. So the very place that he faced opposition, the leader of that group just so happens to be in Titius's house, and Paul starts telling him about who Jesus is. And as he does this, what we see is an amazing thing. It says, his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard him believed and were what? Baptized. And I just want to make a mental note for you guys. If you have come to believe in Jesus and have not been baptized yet, I encourage you to do that. And on August 8th, when we have our celebration of the facility, that this is the 10-year anniversary of this new great facility that God has given us, I encourage you to come to that and sign up to be baptized. You can go into our website, and there's a place where you can sign up online to become baptized. I just believe that that's very important, that it's important to solidify our commitment to follow Christ and to testify to those you know that I have chosen to follow Jesus. So, the point I wanted to make here is that Paul, as he continued to follow the will of God, he faced great opposition. He had to become weary. And as he went and shared with Crispus, the synagogue ruler, says his entire household believed, that had to be incredibly encouraging to Paul. And so this is the reality of life, isn't it? We have many ups and we have many downs, don't we? That there are those moments that we just are saying, God, you are amazing. Look at what you're doing. And the next minute we're going, God, where are you? And we feel totally alone. We feel like maybe we're the only ones dealing with this certain situation in our life. And we go, God, I wish you were here. And I wish there was someone out there that knew what I was going through. Have you ever felt totally alone in the world? Have you ever felt totally alienated? Not only by God, but even alienated from the church. I've been there, done that, friends. This is where Paul might have been, and I believe he was feeling that way. That's why in verse 9, as Paul, I believe, was in his prayer tent and as he was seeking the Lord. It says in verse 9, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city. You see, the Father knew exactly what Paul was going through. The Lord knows exactly what you're going through at this very moment. He knows every situation that we're facing, and he wants us to know that he is here with us. He wants us to not be fearful. He wants us to keep going and following his will, to not be silent. Because one of the things we have to understand, friends, is God calls us to be a missional people. That's why we're going through the book of Acts. He calls us to be the church in a totally unchurched world, just like he called Paul to go to Corinth to share the Messiah in this pagan culture so that they would come to know who Jesus is. You know, there are many people who like to read and they like to know God, but they don't engage in following God. That we may have very strong devotion to God and praying and reading the scriptures, but we just choose to keep it to ourselves. That it's too hard to go out. It's too threatening to share our faith with people. Or I just feel inadequate. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to share my faith with anybody. I don't have time. You just don't know how consuming my life is and the issues that I have to deal with. And that's the way many people experience their Christian life. But that would be like, I subscribe to this magazine. It's a very profound, deep-thinking magazine that many of you may have to grow deeper in life and understanding and culture. It's called Golf Digest. And I very regularly, I'll read through the articles and read about the tips of how to theoretically improve your golf game. It's all in theory, mind you, I have found. But, you know, the things that I read about and the tips that I'm learning would do no good if I never went out to actually practice it and play. It's the same thing with the scriptures. As we see what God's saying to Paul, do not be afraid, keep on speaking, do not be silent, that would mean nothing to any of us unless we actually went out to do those things. This is what God calls us to do, to be a missional people, to go not only to encounter God, which we do, and we experience in him through coming and worshiping him and learning about the scriptures, to encounter others as we engage in fellowship in small groups. But then he says, go encounter the world. Be missional. And as we go encounter the world, that's when we begin to experience God's presence. That's when we begin to experience God giving us faith, because we begin to see God doing things that we would never understand and experience unless we're actually out doing it. That's how I believe we find the abundant life that Jesus called us to. He said, follow me, and I'll give you life and life abundantly. That abundant life comes in relationship with Christ, following him, and serving him. So this great gift comes to Paul because Paul even himself testifies. He says, hey, as he later sends a letter back to Corinth, he says, guys, here's where I was when you first met me in 1 Corinthians 2, 3 through 5. These are not the words of a strong, macho guy that was afraid of nothing. It says, I came to you in what? Weakness and fear and much trembling. My message and my preaching were not not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. How did Paul learn about God's power? by going out and following him and doing what God called him to do. Then he experienced the power of God. Then he experienced God's power being perfected in his weakness. We don't really understand that until we actually say, okay, Lord, I will follow you. I will do what you're calling me to do. When a church does this individually and corporately, a church begins to become truly a light on the hill. A church begins to truly have influence in the culture. But when we just come to hear about God and read about God and pray to God, but don't go out and follow God, we wonder where God is. This is an amazing encounter. And, you know, if you want to get into a job that will really make you neurotic and crazy, become a pastor. And Jane can testify to this. She says he has lost it. But one of the things that you're a pastor is you experience incredible highs and lows in life. You experience the high of actually seeing a life being changed. I love it when the light goes on for a person and they begin to say yes to Jesus. I love seeing people actually following the Lord and risking themselves and beginning to serve him and beginning to share their faith with those they love and know. And you just see the light go on in their life. That is one of the most exciting things as a pastor to do. But there's also great disappointment as a pastor. As a pastor, you see people that seemingly were following Christ at one time. They turn their back to the Lord and they go back to their life, their old life of following the world. And you get greatly discouraged when you see people do that, and you just wonder, what maybe did I do wrong? And we blame ourselves. And we just kind of feel like, God, are you still in this thing? That we go through those moments. Now this week, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, our staff and key leaders in the church, we're all going up to Camp Hope up on the Mesa, and we're having a leadership retreat. At this retreat, what we're going to do is we've been praying for the last month for God to speak to us. Because the way I see where things have gone with Canyon View here in the last 3 years since the Lord brought Jane and I here is that the ship was in disorder and disarray and in disrepair. And the past 3 years we've been getting the ship put together and getting unity in the staff and the leaders and repairing the disrepair in the ship. And it's kind of like the ship is ready to go. And then we're saying, okay, where are we going now? Where are we going in the next 5 years? And that's what we're going up to Camp Hope for this week, is we want to hear God's voice. And we want to see where God is saying to go in the next 5 years, where we as a church at Canyon View can make the most maximum impact for the kingdom. So I would just pray that you guys be praying for us as we go, that God would speak to us so that we can lead in God's way. But that's what we need to do, is we need to go to the prayer tent, and we've been doing that, going to our prayer tent so that God will speak to this, speak into this. So what we see here, as Paul heard from the Lord, in verse 11 it says, so Paul stayed for a year and a half teaching them the word of God. Where God says, Paul, don't be afraid, keep on speaking, don't be silent. He says, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city. When Paul was feeling discouraged, when Paul was feeling alone, God spoke to him, and then Paul did exactly what God told him to do. He stayed in Corinth for another year and a half doing exactly this thing that God told him to do. Keep speaking, Paul. Keep preaching the gospel. There are many here that need to hear this. They need to hear this truth. I think God is saying the same thing to all of us in this room, is don't keep silent. Use the gifts that God's given you. Continue to share his good news and his hope with those who seemingly appear to be the most hardened that you've ever appeared to see. but continue to love them. Continue to demonstrate God's grace to them. Continue to have random acts of kindness in their life. Continue to love them. Let your words